Hey everybody, welcome back to the Least of These podcast. My name is Janai Jackson, and today I want to look at a video that recently came across my YouTube feed. I've actually responded to this YouTuber once before whenever he previously raised the question, why should we trust God? And by the way, I found that to be just a fantastic question for us Christians to wrestle with. And so if you haven't watched that video, I really do recommend that you go and check that video out, right? I honestly thought it was a genuinely good question, right? Even though I didn't really think that Brandon, who is, of course, the creator of that video, approached it in the right way. But to be fair, I really didn't expect him to. After all, he is an atheist and a pretty strident one at that. But still, I think the question that he raised was worth engaging, right? Especially for us Christians. And I think the same thing is true with this video that we're going to be looking at today. Now, technically speaking, Brandon isn't really posing a question in this video so much as he is challenging the validity of an argument, specifically the argument from design, or what's often called the teleological argument for the existence of God. And so without adding too much framing on the front end, I actually want you to hear what he has to say in his own words. And so here's what Brandon had to say.
That if there is a God, if there is some version of a higher power that had some kind of purpose or design or creation, it stopped right there and it wasn't perfect. When we talk about the human body, on the positive side, we talk about the brain, the trillions of connections. But why don't we also talk about back pain? Why don't we also talk about the appendix or wisdom teeth? Things that point to much more naturalistic explanations and also an imperfect creator if there was one. When we talk about the biodiversity of life or the amazing natural architecture of our world, why do we not talk about genetic disorders, diseases, natural disasters, predatory behavior, parasites, and extinctions? But let's be a little more specific. Let's take some of those exact things that we talked about on the plus side and consider their negative attributes. Sure, the human eye is super complex, but what about the blind spot created when the optic nerve passes through the retina? What about all the people with eyesight problems, like cataracts or myopia or blindness? I'm just saying you can't have your cake and eat it too. You cannot just point to the wonderful things and completely ignore all the problems. The immune system is amazing. It is a feat of evolution that rivals almost anything else, but it also malfunctions often and in horrific ways. For anyone here that has had any kind of chronic pain or an autoimmune disease, lupus or arthritis, or even, and simple enough, allergies. An allergy is our immune system responding inappropriately to a non-harmful substance. Kind of takes the wind out of the sails there a little bit. And similar, I mentioned the human genome is something that is absolutely fascinating, except when genetic mutations can lead to horrendous diseases like Huntington's, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis. Are we giving credit to the designer for those? I don't think so. The circulatory system is amazing. But you know what the number one cause of death is? Cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. And sure, the formation of the stars and planets is beautiful. And when we look out from Earth in a nice dark field and see the twinkling stars, it says something of beauty to us. But those stars, many of them are dead. Many of them have exploded, destroying their entire solar systems or being swallowed up by black holes. Space is vast and beautiful and awe-inspiring, but it is also terrifying and uninhabitable and mysterious and deadly. Just thinking of what I mentioned before, I talked about cellular machinery. Yes, crazy. But when it goes bad, you get cancer. I mentioned symbiosis, which is awesome, but it's one step away from becoming parasitic, and that can harm one or both of the organisms that we're benefiting. Our human microbiome is amazing. We're calling it the second brain. We're understanding so much about it, and yet the very things that save our lives, like antibiotics, destroy our biome, or the very conditions that many people have to eat unfavorable, cheap, poor, terrible diets also destroy the microbiome. Are we including all those factors, or are we just pointing out the one good part? Plant communication is pretty cool. Remember what I was talking about with the underground internet and trees helping each other out? They're helping their kin out. They're under the same selective pressures we are. And just like us, they're willing to harm, destroy, and kill, outcompete, essentially, neighboring plants of different species, competing fiercely for resources, and sometimes even releasing chemicals that inhibit the growth of, again, their competition. Communication, but also combat, just like us. And I could go on and on and on, but I think you guys get the point here. I mean, we could list 130 problems with the human human body in under 2 minutes. Things that, if there really was a perfect designer who had an intention of creating us perfectly, would be very, very different. But we can also explain it from a naturalistic phenomenon of evolution about how and why we got here, why these organisms have been doing the best with what they have, but no more. We're not a perfect design. We're intricate. We're amazing. That's what long periods of time will do for you. But we're also pretty broken. Some amalgamation of parts that can barely fit together and sometimes not very well.
All right, so as you can see, Brandon really doesn't spend a lot of time developing this argument, right? The entire video is only about 5 minutes long, and it's clearly not meant to be exhaustive. But honestly speaking, it really doesn't need to be exhaustive, because when you actually think about it, his entire critique is actually very straightforward, right? It really all boils down to this. As Brandon sees it, the argument from design really only leads to two possible conclusions. Either one, there is no creator or designer at all, or two, there is a designer, but that designer is not good. In fact, he would be a pretty terrible designer. Because when we look at the world around us, when we look at the fact that it's filled with so much pain and suffering and disease and natural disasters and even death, it really seems hard to believe that a good and intentional God would create a world such as this one, especially if the goal was for it to be not only habitable, but good for human beings to live in. And so that's the claim that we're going to examine in today's video. Does Brandon actually have a point here? Now, to be clear, this isn't a question that originated with Brandon, right? Many atheists and agnostics have raised this objection many times before. And even many Christians still wrestle with this question even today. And so I really don't want to spend an excessive amount of time on the video itself, but I do want to use it as a starting point to explore the bigger issue that I think Brandon is raising in this video, right? And I want to do that by offering 3 critiques of Brandon's reasoning and really the broader atheist line of argumentation that often gets presented, as a critique of Christianity in particular. All right, so the first critique that I want to make in regard to Brandon's claim, and honestly, this is the first place where I think his critique of the teleological argument for the existence of God really falls short, in my opinion, is that Brandon assumes that good design must mean maximum safety, maximum comfort, and minimal suffering. Now, that assumption is baked into his entire critique, but the problem is that he never actually defends that standard. Right? His examples only work if we assume that the sole purpose of design itself is meant to lead to human comfort. Full stop. Right? And I think most people listening to him will completely miss that. But if you actually stop and think about what he's saying for even just a moment, you'll see that this assumption is plain, it's obvious, and it's present throughout his entire argumentation. And I also need everyone to see that Brandon's point here isn't scientific. Now, that matters because you would expect it to be if he truly held to his naturalistic worldview, but rather his points are philosophical and moral, right? The argument only works if danger itself counts as evidence against design. But as we're going to see, even that angle falls short upon closer examination. But before we get there, I want to clarify what the argument from design actually claims, because I think this is another area where Brandon's argumentation fundamentally misunderstands it, right? Design arguments are arguing for purpose, are arguing for order, and is arguing for intelligibility. Those are the 3 things that it's arguing for, right? That's what they're doing. They are not arguing that the world is perfect or painless, right? To say that would be fallacious and frankly absurd, because we already know that this world is not perfect or painless. Now, the second thing that I want to clarify is that design arguments are meant to tell you what kind of God exists. And I think this is another place where I think Brandon is trying to make the design argument do far more than Christians have ever claimed that it does. You see, the design argument doesn't tell you whether the designer is Zeus or Poseidon or some objection, a god, or even Yahweh himself. All the design argument does is tell us that there is a mind or a designer involved in the designing. That's it, right? Now, to be fair to Brandon, this isn't just an atheist problem. Christians make the same mistake too whenever we engage in apologetics, right? We often try to make arguments from natural theology to say more than they actually say, right? But the problem is that there is no single argument from natural theology that is going to get us to Yahweh specifically. However, there are arguments that can partially lead us to certain attributes that align with Yahweh. And that's really the distinction that matters here. And so once we keep that in mind, we can go back to Brandon's assumption that danger somehow counts as evidence against design. And we see how weak that reasoning really is, right? For example, take something like fire. You see, fire is dangerous, but is fire poorly designed? No, of course we wouldn't say that. Or take a knife. A knife is dangerous, right? It can cut the skin and it can even be used to kill someone. But it can also be used to cut something like an orange or an apple. And so is it too poorly designed? No, of course not. We know that the danger of the knife is not evidence of bad design or even of a bad designer. If anything, it's evidence of real power, of real intellectual capacity. And the same thing is true with fire. Fire can burn, yes, but it can also provide warmth and it can also sustain life. In other words, my friends, just because fire and knives are dangerous, just because they're fragile or capable of causing harm, that does not mean that fragility is evidence of the absence of a designer. If anything, it's evidence of complexity. And just because something is complex, just because something can deteriorate or falter, that does not prove a lack of a designer. Again, even a good designer. Rather, it simply proves that the world that we live in is complex, right? That the things that are found in this world is complex, including human beings. And that, my friends, is not a bug in the argument for design. It's actually a feature. And this actually brings me to my second critique of Brandon's argumentation, which is that he treats human beings like faulty machines rather than moral agents with purpose. And I find this absolutely fascinating because I think it's right here that a deep inconsistency in Brandon's argument shows itself, and really his whole worldview for that matter. To help you see why Brandon gets this wrong, I wanted to use an example from William Paley's book, Natural Theology. In that video, Paley gives us a scenario, really a mental picture of a person walking alongside a beach, right? Alongside the shore of the beach. And as they're walking, they stumble across a watch, right? They pick it up, and as they examine it, they notice the integrity of the watch. Every second, every minute, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. And instinctively, they conclude that this watch points to a watch designer, right? It doesn't just appear out of nowhere, in other words. Someone had to assemble the parts. Someone had to fine tune it. And someone had to order it in just the right way for it to function just as it does in their hands. And so Paley's point here is simple. If we know this instinctively about something like a watch, if we know that watches don't just happen, don't just appear out of nowhere, that someone has to design and create them, then how much more should that be true of something like the world or even human beings themselves? Now, Brandon's critique comes in at this very point. He says, look, there are so many things wrong with the human body, right? We get diseases, we deteriorate, we grow old, we die. And he makes a similar argument about the world more broadly, but I want to focus specifically on human beings here because Brandon looks at us as though we were nothing more than just watches, right? His basic idea is that since human beings have imperfections, since we're not perfect, since we're not invisible, since we're not basically Superman, even though Superman has kryptonite as a weakness for him, but you get the point I'm making. This must mean that whoever designed us is a poor designer. And on the surface, I can understand how that definitely can feel persuasive for a lot of people because we would say something similar about a watch, right? If a watch consistently tells the wrong time, we would say that is poorly designed. We would blame the watchmaker. So it might seem like Brandon has a point here whenever he applies the same logic to humans and even to the world more broadly as a whole. If God exists and human beings are supposed to be his prized creation, then why are we like this? Is basically the question that Brandon is asking us here. But this is where we need to take a step back and examine what Brandon is actually doing here. You see, the key problem is that he's misunderstanding how things are judged. Artifacts, like watches, are judged purely by function, but persons are judged more than just their function, but they're judged by their purpose and their agency. And there's a massive difference between those two categories. You see, if every watch malfunctions, that tells you about something about the watchmaker, and that's fair. But human beings are not watches, right? Human beings are conscious. We are moral. We are meaning-seeking creatures. And that tells us something very, very important. You see, whoever created us is also personal, is also moral, is also capable of meaning in a far deeper sense, right? Because those things are baked into each and every one of us, right? And so all this really shows us is that whoever created us is at least just as complex, if not more, than we are, right? And so what makes this even more striking is that Brandon largely ignores the uniquely human features that point in this direction. Whether intentionally or not is besides the point. Human beings are rational. We have moral awareness. We have a religious impulse. We long for transcendence. We don't just suffer. We suffer about suffering. You see, yes, Brandon points to the horrific realities, and those realities are real. I don't want to sugarcoat this, right? Human beings can be torn apart. We can be tortured. We can be destroyed, even wiped out in an instant. Think of Oppenheimer with that nuclear bomb and then people just disintegrating, right? But he uses those horrors to eclipse everything else that is, distinctly human. That is good, right? Everything that points to a more complex, more holistic picture of what a designer could be like. And I think that tells us something. You see, the moment you treat human beings as nothing more than biological machines whose value is determined solely by their function, you've already assumed atheism from the very beginning. You see, at that point, you're not really critiquing Christianity per se, because Christianity does not view human beings as mere machines to be wound up and just discarded by nature. Rather, it sees human beings as something far more than that. And so, if this point does anything, it actually shows us how bleak and fallacious the naturalistic worldview that Brandon is largely operating off of, although inconsistently, truly is. And to be honest, I think Brandon sees that too, right? Rather, I think he just fails to acknowledge it when it no longer serves his argument. And so I think that leads us to my third and final critique, which is that Brandon's entire argument depends on objective moral judgments that his naturalism simply cannot ground, right? Just think about the language that Brandon uses throughout that video, right? He describes things as horrendous, as broken, as terrifying, as harmful. And he even says that these things shouldn't be this way. Now that's really, really interesting because the word shouldn't really already assumes that there is a way that things should be. Or as we would say as Christians, it assumes that there is an ought baked into the world. Now that's, again, absolutely fascinating because at this point, Brandon is no longer using scientific language, although he should be if he truly believes in a naturalistic worldview, right? If he were consistently operating within strict naturalism, as all atheists really should be, he wouldn't be making moral judgments at all here, at least not in the way that he is currently doing. Because under strict naturalism, the fact that a tornado wipes out an entire city or civilization isn't good or bad. It just is, right? Cancer isn't evil, right? Cancer isn't bad. It's just a mutation, right? Predation by animals like lions and tigers and bears isn't horrific. It's just a biological necessity. That's just the way of life, right? Extinction isn't tragic. It's adaptation, right? These are simply the next steps, in other words, in evolutionary history. And so whether any of that is good or bad isn't even a question that naturalism is equipped to answer, because in a strictly naturalistic framework, there is no such thing as objective good or objective evil, right? Nature just does what nature does. And if nature is all that there is, then suffering has no moral weight to it. It only has surviving value. And I think that's what Brandon is consciously or unconsciously basically ignoring here. And I think this helps us explain why Brandon's argument feels so persuasive to so many people, right? It feels powerful because it borrows moral categories from an entirely different worldview, one that actually has room for things like objective morality. And then what he does is he uses those borrowed categories to make his claims feel more urgent and more pressing onto our consciousness. And the reason this argument feels like it has force is because moral realism feels obvious. And it feels obvious because it is obvious. But moral realism fits far more naturally and far more consistently within a theistic framework than it does within an atheistic one. And again, I think this is what Brandon kind of misses here. And so in the end, this argument against God only works, if we want to say that it works at all, because it borrows categories that make the most sense if God exists. And when you really stop and think about it, it's not just ironic, it's actually pretty remarkable and funny, to say the least. And so now that we've seen that Brandon's critique of the teleological argument is actually just incoherent and inconsistent within his own naturalistic framework, I want to pivot and take some time to explain what Christianity actually teaches. Because I think once we understand this, Brandon's critique really starts to lose the sting that it has, not just for atheists, but also just for the Christians who are, starting to think about these issues for the first time, and they're starting to be captivated by these types of arguments online. You see, in Christian theology, we believe in a central biblical narrative framework, and it moves in four major categories. It starts with creation, then fall, then redemption, and then restoration. Those four movements make up the entire biblical meta-narrative, which, for those who don't know, is basically the story that gives meaning to every smaller human story throughout human history. Now, I could do an entire multi-hour series just unpacking this framework for us, but for our purposes here, I want to walk through each stage just briefly so that we can gain some conceptual clarity about what the Bible actually teaches us here. And so let's start with the first major step. Let's start with the creation. In Genesis, it says, in the beginning, God created everything, right? The sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, all that it's in it, basically everything. And the Bible goes out of its way, interestingly enough, to tell us that God declared that his creation is good. Now, my friends, that's important because that means from the very beginning, creation was ordered, right? It was functioning as it was designed to function. It had a purpose. But, and this is a distinction that really matters in Christian theology, it was good, but not yet glorified, right? In other words, creation was not created in its final state. It was good, but it was not yet brought to its ultimate end. Now, that distinction helps us understand why goodness does not automatically mean permanence or invisibility or immunity from change. All of that is assumptions that we want to bake into the word goodness, but it's not necessarily required. And so then we move to the next stage of redemptive history, which is the fall. Now, this is the moment we all know all too well. In the Garden of Eden, where Adam, representing all of humanity, rebels alongside his wife Eve, and they both deliberately disobey God's command not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it's at that moment that things like disorder and decay and death are introduced as the human consequence, or as just the consequence of human rebellion. And God had warned them that eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil would certainly lead to their death. And while they did not immediately drop dead, that itself, my friends, was mercy, And I think a lot of people miss that. I remember someone asked R.C. Sproul that, and he completely lost his mind in the best R.C. Sproul type of way. But it's totally valid because a lot of people miss how merciful God's ability to give life to Adam, even after he deliberately disobeyed him, really was. But more back to the point, death had entered the world, right? Creation retained a measure of order, but it was now fractured, right? It was subject to corruption, and it was marked by decay exactly because of sin. But thankfully, the story does not end there, because God is not only just, but he's also loving and merciful. And we already saw that with what he does with Adam and Eve, right? But more so, he's merciful because now he enters into human history itself, right? He enters into our suffering, into our pain, and into our consequences of our rebellion, which he continued to participate in ever since Adam's fall. And he does so through the greatest act of injustice in human history, which is the suffering and death of the only truly righteous and innocent man, which of course is Jesus Christ, who suffers on behalf of all of humanity in order to redeem it. And so that brings us to the final stage of the biblical narrative, that being restoration. Now, those who are in Christ are promised a future hope, a future glorification, a new creation, as Paul, of course, tells us in 2 Corinthians. And this new creation is not a patched up version of the old one, but rather it's a fully restored and fully glorified reality that there will be no sickness. There will be no more crying. There will be no more pain. In fact, I love Revelation 21 because it just gives us this breathtaking picture where John sees a future in which God dwells with his people forever and everything is made new, right? This is the world as it was always designed to be. A world that is unstained by sin, unstained by rebellion, and free from corruption. It's the very world that atheists are longing for, and they don't even realize it. And that, my friends, is what Christianity actually teaches. You see, unlike naturalism, Christianity does not teach that this is all that there is, right? That the world simply is what it is. Rather, Christianity explicitly tells us that the world is not operating as God ultimately intended to be. And more importantly, that this is not how God intends it to remain. Now, that's really important. And so when we apply this biblical framework to Brandon's critique, we start to see that it really doesn't hold up at all. In fact, what Brandon presents as evidence against Christianity is already baked into Christianity's worldview itself. Take disease, for example. Brandon treats disease as though it somehow disproves the kind of creator that Christians believe in. But disease makes perfect sense within the biblical framework. It is exactly what we should expect in a fallen world. Or take death as an example. Scripture explicitly names death as an enemy, one that will not have the final word for those who are in Christ. We see this in Matthew chapter 16, where he says the gates of Hades will not prevail against us. The gates of Hades is the realm of the dead. It is death itself. Or you can take or consider natural danger, right? The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans that creation itself is groaning, and it's waiting for the day when all things will be made right. Now, again, just think about that. Think about what Paul is saying there. He's saying that the ground, the animals, the wildlife, or whatever the case may be, they're all groaning. They're all waiting for that day when Jesus will come back and make all things new. That is the Christian claim. Now, whether or not you believe that or not is another thing. But if you are going to critique Christianity rightly, that is what we are actually saying. And so the world that Brandon describes, the world he thinks counts as evidence against Yahweh, is actually the very world Christianity predicts and presents. And so when we step back, we start to see the oddity of his critique. You see, his argument essentially boils down to this. Things aren't the way that they should be. And again, we already covered how that's absolutely fascinating, especially coming from someone who believes all that there is just nature itself. And so the idea that he's even using language of should and shouldn't is just actually incoherent in his framework. And yet Brandon feels it. right? He senses that something is wrong, right? Something is not operating as it should be. And Christianity says, yes, Brandon, you get it. Something is wrong. In fact, the Bible tells us in the 3rd chapter of its very first book that something has gone deeply wrong with the world and with humanity because of Adam's sin, right? This isn't a surprise, in other words, to the Christian worldview, my friends. It's foundational to it. And that's why everyone, including Brandon, and even creation itself, longs for something better, right? The reason why Brandon is hardwired to ask the ought questions, even though his worldview says that that's incoherent to even ask the ought questions, is because eternity has been written inside of Brandon's heart, right? The designer, whose name is Yahweh, has made Brandon, and every other human being for that matter, inherently moral and inescapably religious. And so whether Brandon wants to acknowledge that reality or not is completely up to him. But as we can see from his own argumentation, he's already bearing witness to it himself. And so what can we take away from all this? Well, the first thing that we can take away is that Christianity is not afraid of your questions, right? It's not afraid of the ugliness of this life, of this world, or of its imperfections. And so as Christians, we don't need to hide from this or cower at the volume of Brandon's critique here. The world that Brandon presents, the world that is filled with danger and suffering and brokenness and deterioration, is actually the very world that the Bible presents to us in the very pages of sacred scripture, right? None of this should be new to us. We should not be surprised by any of this. We should not be like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to answer this. Yes, you do. It's right there. It's like, yeah, Brandon, what's your point? Right? And so that leads me to the next takeaway, which is that this is exactly why we need to be in our Bibles as much as possible. If you're a Christian, of course, because if anything that Brandon has said genuinely surprised you, genuinely caught you off guard, then that should be a wake-up call for you just to understand your faith a bit more deeply, right? You see, we should want to understand what we believe first and foremost for ourselves, but also so that we're better equipped for moments like this, moments where our faith is challenged or questioned by unbelievers. And we want to do that not because apologetics is where we do evangelism, right? That's not the goal, and it's never been the goal of apologetics. Rather, apologetics helps us to do exactly what the scripture tells us to do in 1 Peter, which is to be ready to give a defense for why we believe what we believe. You see, you can't defend what you do not understand. But anyways, guys, look, that's the video. If this video was helpful for you, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe and do all of that good stuff. I wanted to get this video out for y'all because it's been something that's been in the queue, or really Brandon just made the video and I was just like, I got to finish my series on Matthew chapter 16, but sometimes you just got to make a video on some of the things that are just coming up. I feel like it's relevant right now. And so I wanted to make this video real quick. I thought it was very interesting. And so if this was helpful, please let me know in the comment section, right? Show me some love. But look, until next time, guys, peace.